we have our presentation on the California BayDelta. Dr. Ted Sommer is the lead scientist for the California Department of Water Resources. He has worked in the Delta for over 20 years, conducting and documenting research on floodplain ecology, native fish restoration, and salmonid biology. Ted represents DWR in multiple fora, committees, and programs spanning most of the Delta science and management landscape. Dr. Josh Collins is the lead scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, SFEI, where he oversees the development and integration of SFEI scientific work. Dr. Collins is a landscape ecologist and a regional ecological planner with specialized expertise in mapping and assessing stream and wetland ecosystems. He has extensive practical experience as a leader for a variety of efforts in the West to set long-range ecological goals and assessment methods. Among his current advisory roles, he chairs the technical team supporting California's new wetland and riparian area protection policy. His experience and current work afford him a clear view of San Francisco Bay science and management efforts. And both Ted and Josh will be splitting the presentation on the California BayDelta. Thanks so much.
So that's right, we are going to split the baby, which is obviously a terrible idea, but that should tell you something straight away. It tells you something about our approach to both management and science of these two systems. I think that's a story in itself. So starting first with the Delta, that in itself is a tough nut to kind of crack. I struggled with how to present things. You know, we could talk about the basic geography, where it is, but to be honest, a lot of folks that live right next to the Delta don't even realize they're right next to the Delta. Here in Davis, we're just a few miles away from it. Most folks in Davis don't realize where it is. We can talk about the statistics. You know, it drains almost half of the state. It's got 1,000 miles of levees. It's got 60,000 acres of open water habitat. But even that really doesn't get you to the kind of sense of place. One of the best ways, I think, to come to grips with the Delta and how science is constructed around it is to really go straight to the extremes. Your basic garden variety Delta has an ocean and a river, and it drains properly from inland to the ocean. It fans out. The gods were clearly drunk when they did our Delta. They put the Delta facing the wrong way. And that has all kinds of consequences for hydrodynamics and management, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of those things. So the other example is that when we do landscape alteration here, we do not mess around. Here's an example from San Francisco Estuary Institute, who've done some great work on the historical ecology of the system. You can look at the historical map and see the vast area of tidal wetlands, the large area of green. It's shown in a bar chart just off to the right, shows you just what a high percentage tidal wetlands comprised. There was also fairly complex small channels. You compare that to the modern day system, mostly agriculture, and we greatly simplified things. The other example of extremes that we deal with here in both our management and science is extremes in our precipitation. So the big issue is most of the precipitation falls in the north and most of the population is in the south. And here we have a state that is the 6th largest economy in the world, and when Brexit hits, will be the 5th largest. Go Brexit. It's the water supply for 25 million people. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but we've got this crazy imbalance to work with here. And this is all driven by hydrology. We have most of the inflow coming from just one of the rivers, the Sacramento River, although we do get some inputs from some of the other tributaries as well. And some of it actually makes it out to the bay. An awful lot of it is redistributed to other areas where a lot of the population sits. So the other wild and crazy thing we do here is lots and lots of barriers and gates. I don't know if it's quite as extreme as the Everglades example we saw, but we have some really unusual uses of these different barriers. So one of the examples includes the Sassoon Marsh salinity control gates, where we operate gates to tidally pump fresh water. We're diverting water, and so there's salinity intrusion. We operate gates to try and get fresh water into one of our large contiguous marshes. We have the Delta Cross Channel. We have a large channelized corridor in the Central Delta. The Cross Channel helps us control when and how floodwaters and fish get in this area. Also down in the South Delta, we have a whole network of barriers there because of the elevation changes from all the diversions there. We actually need gates to maintain elevations. Which brings us to the diversions. That's probably the most remarkable thing about the system there. That's really different than any of the other systems that we've talked about here. The state and the federal water projects are the big players, but of course we have a couple thousand smaller ag diversions as well that play a huge role. Of course, the big challenges don't stop there. Climate change, as you heard from all the other speakers, is an emerging issue. Because of the climate variability we alternate between flood and drought, and of course drought is very much on our minds. And then on top of that, the landscape is gradually subsiding. Parts of the delta 25 foot below water level, just waiting for a big earthquake or flood. And given those changes, it's not surprising that we have a whole suite of species that are in trouble. The most prominent are the Chinook salmon, spring run, winter run Chinook salmon, but Delta smelt and its cousin, the longfin smelt, feature heavily. And we also have steelhead trout and green sturgeon. So collectively, the status of these species is a really big deal in both the science and management. I would characterize, given how important water is in the state and the effect these species have on management, these are the most economically important fish species we have in the United States. But there's more. On top of all of this, we have extreme effects from invasive species. We saw some of this in the Great Lakes and the Everglades as well. Aquatic weeds are one of our newest and most impressive changes. Some of the recent estimates from UC Davis, 30% of the open water in the Delta now has aquatic weeds on it. That's not something we have seen here yet, and it's hard to know what the consequences are. Similarly, we have major benthic invasions that have totally transformed the food web, and so it's not surprising on top of that that the fish communities are shifting rapidly. So we're seeing a move away from pelagic communities and towards more benthic and inshore communities. And a lot of those, again, are driven by invasive species as well. Water quality is another major science and management issue here. Given our agricultural economy, it's not surprising that we have an ever-shifting array of different contaminants that are coming in the system. We have, like some of the other locations we heard about, issues with nutrients, although the story is moderately different here. Harmful algal blooms in the past 10 plus years or so have really become a serious issue. And this year in particular, we've seen some of the most striking harmful algal bloom issues in the South Delta, but also statewide in places where we're redistributing the water. So given all this, as you might expect, the institutional complexity is extreme. I think Mark Lobel may be talking more about this tomorrow, but they've done some modeling on the institutional folks that are involved in all of this. And you see on the left all of the different groups there. And I know we just saw a nice structured figure from the Great Lakes. I am not seeing any structure here, but we do have organizations. It's a little clearer when you look at the central players, and we do have some organization, but it just does give folks a sense of all of the challenges we have in balancing both the resource management and the science. Like a lot of the other places that we've discussed today, we have a whole suite of players involved here. The universities like UC Davis, San Francisco State, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, all feature very heavily in the sort of research that's going on here. The agencies play a huge role in the monitoring, so we have a broad collection of both state and federal agencies involved. But I also want to point to some of the other folks. NGOs, consultants, and public water agencies are also huge players in contributing to the science. So how do we make all of this work together? How do we collaborate? Well, like everywhere else, this is a struggle. There's so many issues, so many different people involved. We kind of do our best. So there are individual efforts like the Delta Science Program that try and provide some overall vision. Delta Regional Monitoring Program that try and provide some cohesiveness to some of the key water quality issues. The Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, not a kind of public effort, but it's an effort to keep some of the key parties that have been warring over water issues out of the courts. The state and federal water contractors do their best to kind of pool resources. Interagency Ecological Program is probably the most cohesive one, trying to bring together a suite of state and federal agencies with a nexus by which the public can participate, stakeholders can participate, but also there's a series of agency layers that allow managers and directors to provide input as well. So lots of different models to try and collaborate. One thing I did want to point out is none of this includes co-location, and I didn't hear that discussed for any of the locations here. Personally, one of the things I believe is that co-location is a big deal for science, getting a critical mass of scientists together that can work together. And so one of the solutions, I think some of you are aware that we're working towards, is at least building a new IEP field station where we can at least co-locate a lot of the monitoring efforts that we're doing right now and hopefully build some synergies. But again, co-location is not currently a part of the program. Science topics, this is something you can blame me for, but I took a crack at describing things I think we do pretty well, things I think we do terribly, and things we're improving rapidly on. So in the terrible column, I think most folks would agree we're pretty sad at doing things like contaminants and some of the smaller invertebrates. We actually, though, do a pretty good job on relative measurements of some of the fish species, distribution. We're really good at some of the basic water quality. We're really good at flow, and kind of okay at invertebrates and phytoplankton. And much of our monitoring innovation right now is going on in a lot of these areas in the central column, which includes trying non-lethal sampling, because we have so many different listed species that we're dealing with, looking more and more at off-channel habitats, because much of the program we have is designed really around channel habitats. We're really improving our capabilities on synthesis and using more continuous sensors, and also in the phytoplankton area, I wanted to emphasize new efforts to look at harmful algal blooms and macrophytes. So that's kind of the most vibrant area of science right now, and again, that's my opinion. Funding-wise, this is an estimate that is from a Delta Science Program database here. It's kind of our best estimate right now. It does not include all sources of funding, particularly NGOs, utilities, and contractors. It's really focused also mostly on the Delta. There are other sources, but think of this as kind of a reasonable relative approximation. A couple things I wanted you to see from this. First, since 2000, there's been a general increase in funding. The second thing is the funding sources aren't particularly diversified. It's mostly coming right now in the Delta from 3 different agencies: the Bureau of Reclamation, Delta Stewardship Council, and DWR. And that graph sort of continues on. This is the IEP budget since 2012, when the last one cut off. And this is the bulk of the graph you just saw. Our budget since then has been reasonably stable. By contrast, the number of issues we're dealing with has increased steadily. I also wanted to note that there's also a bit of an imbalance in the way a lot of the science is being done in the Delta. And again, this is kind of my opinion, but If you break down the IEP budget that I just showed you into compliance, directed studies, synthesis, and modeling, more than 70% of our budget is just going into compliance and monitoring of standard things. So, excuse me. Oh, I've gone. Did I go back? There it was. We are making improvements on synthesis, and we still have some directed studies, but there's a sliver you can't even really see, which is solicited research. We're not doing much in the way of solicited research. That was not the case historically. We did historically have funds available for that. Our compliance costs have gone up and up. Our budget has been flat, and the net effect is the compliance and monitoring takes a larger piece of the puzzle. So with that, I think, Josh, you're up.
Good afternoon. We're going to go downstream now and then look upstream. And the fact, as Ted was just saying, that he sets aside and I step up to look from the downstream perspective is an indication of the extent to which we've taken this system and found some way to carve it up. And we are working to put it back together again. Those of you who are from outside the region, this is a call for help. Most of you look as though you've done a better job for a longer period of time in trying to put your systems back together again. So we're on that trajectory, but we have a ways to go. So this is the BayDelta system. I throw this term up about every 2 years, the greater Golden Gate ecosystem, hoping it'll catch on, and it never does. But here we go again. So we have the Delta watersheds, 3 principally. We have the Delta, as Ted was talking about. We have the Bay and its watersheds. And we have this thing called the Gulf of the Farallones that never gets talked about. But if you've ever had the pleasure of going out the Golden Gate or back in, actually if you went out, maybe did come back in, you'll know that it's a long ways out the gate before you get away from the estuary. It's a long ways before the water turns color, before you feel as though you're actually away from the influences of that greater Golden Gate ecosystem. So arguably, the Gulf is part of it. Maybe the next time we do this, somebody from the Gulf will be up here to talk about that. Or better yet, one person to talk about the Gulf, the Bay, the Delta, and its watersheds. But we're not there yet. So back in the Bay Area here, it's a big place in terms of number of people. It's a big place in terms of an economic engine. It's a big place ecologically in terms of number of rare and endangered species that occupy this place. It's only been around for, 5,000 or 7,000 years. There's been endemism in that amount of time. There's a huge amount of caring people. The modern environmental movement was based in part on this place called the Bay Area. The Sierra Club is from here. All that kind of stuff is part of the legacy. You would think we'd be further along than we are, given that. But there's always enough money in this magical place for so many bright people to get something started that then peters out. It's very hard to get a consistent, coherent focus that lasts more than 2 or 3 one-off something or others. So part of what we're dealing here was just too much money, too much intelligence, and not enough time, and everybody trying to do the best they can. That's an underlying theme in the Bay Area. Horizontal structure in organizations, both public and private, invented here. Why? Because nobody wants to take charge. Nobody is in charge. Okay, Bay history. I'm going to look back, and as near as I can tell, when you look back, what you see depends upon where you sit. So this is something of a homespun, my version of the history of the Bay Area relative to what we're talking about today. Other people could tell a different story, and this isn't complete. One of the problems of giving a talk like this in your home ecosystem is there are people in the audience who know better. So I apologize to all of you who will be offended by this or don't see yourself up here. It's the way it is. Your turn is next. Okay, like we've heard before, one of the things that happened was EPA walked into the San Francisco Bay and said, this is the national estuary. People said, I beg your pardon, what is the national estuary? Well, you qualify for the National Estuary Program, we'll dump some money on you, just figure out how it doesn't work and then fix it, and you'll keep getting some money. If you agree to that, you get a CCMP, a Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. If that comes out of a region, and some of you, like we've already heard about the National Estuary Program from other speakers, If a region produces that thing, which is not easy, and the governor signs it, which is unlikely, and it goes to EPA and the secretary signs it, it is an article of law of the Clean Water Act. Thou shalt do this thing. And all that happened. And everybody who worked on it went, what? And then we had this instrument of law that we could implement. Well, it was about the whole system, this thing we just talked about, the Greater Golden Gate ecosystem, for lack of a better name, and it pulled down to this, the Bay Area. The CCMP went big and then hit political walls and fell back to the Bay Area. I'll come back to this point in a minute. But that decision, however it was made, just perpetuated the problem that we're trying to overcome now. So we have a legal instrument still on the books. CCMP gets updated. Most recently, this year, just came out again. Always talks about the whole system, always gets applied to the Bay Area. That called for a regional research strategy. Sounds like we're on the right path. 1993, a regional research strategy. It produced the RMP, the Regional Monitoring Program. RMP is Regional Monitoring Program for Water Quality. Why? It's EPA driven. This is the Clean Water Act. We're about water quality. Go do that one first. And the structure was in hand for EPA to say, and by the way, if you don't, state of California, you won't get some of the money that you're promised. So we got an RMP for water quality. That focuses on ambient monitoring around San Francisco Bay and Sassoon, an area in between the Bay Area and the Delta, for the purposes of saying whether or not all the MPDS permits, all the permits for sewage treatment facilities and storm drain systems are actually working. Are those individual permits adding up to something better for the Bay? The RMP decides whether it is. It's a very important program, but it came through the Water Quality Act of EPA. On the other side of this, we have been trying to force ecological considerations into the research program, into other RMPs, setting goals. Let's set targets for habitat, both subtidal, intertidal, for uplands habitat. Maybe through that, once we get targets, we can have a monitoring program to move over towards another RMP. And that's kind of where we're going now. We're on the verge of maybe having this after 25 years. It was called for the original CCMP. Maybe now we get it. We have, those of us involved with this initiative have said, let's do the Delta too, let's do the Delta too. And the answer is, no, not yet. So we're still trying to create something in either place that can move upstream or downstream, and we're having trouble with that. If we get these RMPs going, then what we're really aiming for, and this is written up in the CCMP, the new actions are all about watershed and landscape-based monitoring and research and permitting. Then we go to the Bay Area, and maybe, you know, if we can get rid of that ridiculous system that broke up the CCMP into these two areas, we can get all the way back up to the whole system again. But the real charge now, the frontier of both environmental science and monitoring, as research and monitoring in the Bay, is around the idea of a watershed approach to coordinated environmental review and permitting across the Clean Water Act and across the Endangered Species Act. And essentially what's happening is that climate change, sea level rise and other aspects of climate change, drought and deluge, as Ted was talking about, is creating a climate of change where regulators and managers are saying, how are we going to deal with this, not by ourselves, not individually? At what scale do we coordinate permitting? You don't get rid of permits. You can't integrate them. It's against the law. So they have to be coordinated. At what scale do we coordinate environmental review and permitting so that we can get ahead of these issues and not be hurting ourselves with so much complex regulatory framework? Speaking of framework, when I sit down with new staff and get them some idea of what they're going to be doing if they stick around, I usually end up saying something like this. And when I was putting the talk together for the first time, I just wrote it down. In the Bay Area, we think in threes. And you saw it in Great Lakes where they had three colors. You know, this is poor, and this is okay, and this is good. Well, that's what we got here. We think in past, present, and future, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Federal, state, and local, integrate vertically through government with science. It doesn't do any good for science to reach across to one level of government, because in this country, you have to integrate vertically. Environmental laws are implemented mostly by local agencies. That's where land use happens, and land use controls the environment. So you have to integrate vertically. We're aware of that in the Bay Area. Not that we do it, but we always think federal, state, local. Near term, midterm, and long term. Keep the big thing out there, know what you're going to do, take baby steps are what you get. There are no home runs in government. There are a lot of singles, know when the bases are loaded. And there's other things up here, other triplets you can imagine. Like one of them is no, maybe, yes. That's a pretty common one. You can think of them yourself. You, me, who is not just funny, it's this that who is the audience? We're always saying, okay, we come to agreement now. What larger body of consensus do we develop to actually get off top dead center and do something? Who else needs to be involved? So this is the practical way we organize everything we do. On the science side, on the policy side, on the public side, we really think in threes along the lines that I put up here. This is homespun, but I would stand by it. Obey, transform, back to the past, present, and future. The historical ecology part that Ted was talking about was done for the basic reason that in the Bay Area, we had lots of people fighting over what this piece of land should be next. Literally, agency people in the same agency yelling at each other in meetings. And I thought, well, what did it used to be? And they couldn't agree. So we created this program of gazillions of people to reconstruct the past in a geographic information system in great detail, 1 to 200 scale, 1 to 500 scale, much more detail than this. And it lives on because everybody loves the past. Everybody shares the history, and they're not at fault for it. So we found, quite surprisingly but wonderfully, you can take people who are fighting over something and get them to reconstruct the past, they become friends, and they blow right through the present and start talking about the future. Now, that isn't to say that the past is something you can reach. Ecosystems don't run backwards. We all know that. But when you do this historical ecology, you see what you used to have, and you understand how things have changed, and you know what you can manage and what you can't manage, and you can aim for things that you can really do. So the past, present, and future is important, and the past matters. Not because you can reach it, not because you can reproduce it, but because it informs your thinking about what the future should be. 85% of the marshlands that were around the bay have been converted to commercial uses. This is a theme that I'm hearing today. Wetlands matter. Why? Well, for a lot of scientific reasons, but everybody meets there. Lots of policies, both terrestrial and aquatic, meet in the wetland. They really are transitional, not just in ecological terms, but in political terms. So it's a good place to work out your problems. If you can bring the wetlands back, you can do other things. In the Bay Area, we are quite literally following the Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act from the bay waters to the wetlands into watersheds. We're just following the flow upstream, and slowly, maybe too slowly. Hence the need for coordinated permitting. So the key science topics in the Bay Area are so common to you. Freshwater supply, sediment supply, water quality, population growth, sea level rise, and many of the related topics. Everything we've already talked about. Freshwater flows, most of it's coming from the delta, a little bit from the local. It's not the whole story. Dividing the delta throughput is, it's the unnatural timing and impact of downstream ecology that really matters. Here's the kind of synthesis we do. Here we put together an index of fish health based upon numerous species compiled into a metric, kind of an uber metric here, showing the declining condition as you go upstream with time. But we have all these local streams coming into the bay. These are a bunch of little estuaries. Every one of these streams has its own estuary. And when you look at them, they matter a lot in terms of their ecological services, sediment supply, freshwater supply, and cultural resources. There's a lot of ecological services provided by our local estuaries. And so we see the Bay Area as a complex of many smaller estuaries. I'm sure you see this in your own systems. These various kinds of services that are abundant all around the bay, attending their individual estuaries. Sediment supply is a remarkable story. The throughput is there. Local watersheds is more. That didn't used to be the case. So it used to be that the delta, the throughput of sediment from the delta was the largest supply. That's being turned off by the dams in the Sierra Nevada, which retaining a lot of sediment, the reduction in erosion off the land surfaces. But in the meantime, we still have the erosion around the bay. So the bay is now becoming the dominant source of fine sediment that we need for building marshes. At the same time, we have TMDLs for fine sediment telling people to turn off the supply of fine sediment in the watersheds. So we haven't connected the watersheds to the bay. We've disconnected the bay from the delta, and we've disconnected the watersheds from the bay all the way around with our policy and our practices. The chemical contaminants on the water quality side are numerous. These are the other related water quality issues. We're doing pretty well on some of this. We now tend to convert all the detailed monitoring on individual contaminant species into consumption advisories, these kinds of things that roll up the information into practical applications, in this case around what you can and can't eat, depending upon who you are and where you are. Microplastics is a big deal now. We measured them for the first time and said, holy cow, there's a lot of them. The research does the whole food web piece. We find that we've got more of it than some of the rest of you do. But when it gets to monitoring, it turns out we go the other way. So we use the research to figure out what the pathway of contamination is. And what we're really caring about is not the plastic, it's about the living resources affected. So then we monitor those living resources. If they're okay, no need for more of the research. If they're not okay, now we have to reverse engineer the research project and go back to cause and effect. On the nutrient side, it gets fairly complex. We got some coming out of the Delta, of course. We have quite a bit coming out of wastewater treatment facilities. That red arrow in there is a reminder that the Gulf actually exists and the Golden Gate's a real place and stuff go in and out of there. The flux is about neutral, though. And then we have the stormwater systems all the way around the bay. We don't know where we're going. We have a lot of nitrogen coming into the system. It's a cloudy water right now. If we clean it up with the reduction in sediment supply, it gets clear, the light penetrates down, and boom, the whole thing goes green. So how do we take care of that problem? Do we retool all these public treatment organizations or structures? That's billions of dollars in retooling. So we're asking the question, well, is green bad? Probably green's not good because there are HABs involved with green. But we're asking the question, where do we need to be on that response curve of the system? It's not automatic for science to say, this is good, or this is okay, or that's fair. You get the idea. We're on that poor, fair, good idea now around what color the bay should be. We have a strategy for doing this, and we have research coming through the permit structure. That is, the POTWs are paying into a research program to see how far we have to go with POTW cleanup to solve the nutrient problem. We're realizing there's some management options here. We have, in the south part of the San Francisco Bay, a lot of historical salt ponds that are being restored now to tidal marsh. When you open them up, they start bleeding chlorophyll and nitrogen out into the system. So we can manage those in such a way that they don't augment the problem coming through the POTWs. So we're realizing there's some options here at the landscape scale for managing different parts of the system to solve a problem. And of course, some of this could turn into HAB risk, so that's driving a lot of this. Sea level rise, I'm getting through here. We have wonderful graphics coming through NOAA and from a local consortium involving Point Blue Conservation Organization, an NGO that's working with NOAA and USGS to produce these kinds of models that relate both tidal flooding and riverine flooding. We got all these people that are going to be affected. You know, our numbers are big too, just like your numbers. So we're all in trouble here. But this is driving a lot of concern. How do we move the infrastructure? Google, all of these organizations are within this zone of blue that's going to be affected. And you know that the sea level rise estimates are going to be revised upwards, not downwards. We know that the targets we're dealing with now as a planning horizon are not the right ones. We all know that we have to either move further or otherwise these numbers are going to go up. I guess that's my point. They're not going to go down. Population growth, these are our projections. I like to think it won't really happen. You know, it can't really happen, but maybe it will. So we have to deal with this also. And part of this is that when sea level rise begins to squeeze the population between the bay and the higher ground that's steeper, it's going to be squeezing more people. So we wonder how we're going to marry those two efforts together. And that's not the same thing. So how do you marry transportation planning with population, with housing planning, with environmental planning? The CCMP I spoke about is kind of a blueprint for the bay, but it's not looked upon with the same authority or importance as the regional transportation planning or the regional economic or housing planning, even though it probably needs to be on the same footing. Sea level rise for us is about these transition zones. We have very little natural transition zone left. Most of it's urbanized. In fact, only about 23% of the area in blue with sea level rise is actually undeveloped and protected at this time. That means we have to move people or somehow build a lot of levees that have to be built over and over again. Institutional changes, as I said, is one estuary with many divisions. We only have 2 states, and yet we're having a hard time. Different water quality control boards, that's a regulatory agency of some importance. Different coastal planning agencies, different habitat joint ventures, an NGO that does a lot to create wetlands. Different politics. You know, if you're in this side of the line up here, you get one newspaper. If you're downstream, you get a different newspaper. So they see themselves differently. The politics are managed differently. They're almost different cultures. Separate science enterprise, we don't have it yet, but if we get there, we may end up with 2 enterprises if we're not careful. Why does it matter? Well, obviously, there's some of these things that are just crossing the line. Estuarine transgression doesn't care where that line is. Freshwater supply doesn't care, nutrient supply doesn't care, sediment supply doesn't care, and that means fish don't care, and there's all kinds of things that don't care. So as scientists, we're aware of this, and we're trying to follow these kinds of themes to move the line further upstream, if not dissolve it. Lots of partners for this. The thing I want to point out is the private sector. I put Google down there. I ran out of people to put down. But increasingly, we're looking out, reaching out to the people who are at risk because of these environmental problems and saying, this is your world too. We don't want, you know, Silicon Valley to move to Utah and Salt Lake just because they can. And why are they here? Because of the aesthetic and environmental amenities. If they've been polled and they say, we can go anywhere, we like it here. It's not Stanford. Stanford's just online. It's because of the Bay. So we have to protect the aesthetic. That matters, or we lose the economic engine. So pay up, Google. You know, we have some research to do. So we have these collaboratives. There aren't as many. We don't have an enterprise. We don't have a single forum. We don't even have the BayDelta Science Program. It's not down all the way down into the Bay part of this. We have a few enterprising groups that are starting to work together, and it's really very important. Science topics. This is Ted's slide, and I went ahead boldly and followed his suits. Now you've created something. This will be in the new State of the Estuary report. We'll organize it this way. I just want to focus on the needs. So on the water quality side, we need to integrate across management actions. That's really clear. Water quality is a result of a whole soup of things going on individually and not controlled very well. Under habitat, we don't do ambient surveys of threatened and endangered species. We just don't do it very well. Occasionally we do it, and then we don't know how to use the data because we don't have a good time series. We don't know anything about the resilience thresholds for habitats. How much is enough? How many of this species or that species is viable? How much habitat is enough? And what distribution abundance and patch size and inner patch distance? All those kinds of metrics, we don't have the answers. And we need a wetland RMP that goes upstream and downstream. Sea level rise, we need to map the T-zone. We need to evaluate the T-zone. And we need to get that started in the Delta. I mean, all the fundamental work by NASA and NOAA that enables us to identify the T-zone hasn't been done in the Delta yet. We cannot rectify tidal datums with geodetic datums in the Delta. So we can't run the tides over the land with any accuracy. That needs to be fixed. Sediment supply, well, we're looking at augmentation and reuse methods, but we basically have to make sure that we look at all the sources of sediment and figure out how to exploit them. Sediment is going to be a commodity for us. And then finally, we're finally moving, and this is for the social scientists, thank you for showing up. We are moving to social ecological systems. We're backing into it, kind of. We're walking into that door and going, what is this about? But we have to get the people more involved. Public polling is getting better. We passed a tax in the Bay Area, a property tax to fund restoration. That's a big step forward, but we need to get people more directly involved. We need a consistent research and ambient monitoring between the Gulf and the Delta for key concerns, such as wetland restoration, water quality, and so forth. And then just a quick look at funding. It's mostly driven by permits. It's mostly project-based. The regional monitoring program is itself permit-based, as I said. That's what we that's the hook right now, is to follow permits to money for monitoring. Research comes along through its own avenues in SF. We're blessed with a lot of wonderful academic institutions, including the one we're at today. They find money, but their job is to push basic research, not to make it always applied. And we haven't done a good job of translating or aligning basic research with applied research. Most of it is institutional, including some very powerful science NGOs. But we don't track the costs. My time is up, and luckily I'm through. We have some great ways of communicating, though. We're a talented region for this kind of thing. We have, regular conferences and reports. We have the Estuary magazine. We have the Pulse of the Estuary for the Water Quality Monitoring Program. Bay Nature is a public magazine, comes out every month, dedicated to this kind of information. Lots of symposia, lots of syntheses, as Denise was talking about. We're good on that. And we're building some online data aggregation delivery systems. Delta Live, you'll hear about that, and the California Eco Atlas. And we thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience? Go ahead and raise your hand. No questions? Everyone wants a break. Oh. Jaylen.
This is a question for both speakers. How do you get there from here?
That's our question back to the audience. That's why we have the panels coming up and all day tomorrow. I think, honestly, without being glib, getting outside perspective like this is really an important idea. When you're dealing with the same problem, it becomes parochial. And if you're not careful, you just keep staring at each other and reinventing the problem. So going outside for perspective is really vitally important. At this scale of organization, I mean, where it is better coordinated science to support larger bodies of policy in a coherent way more than once. Okay.
There's another question. There's a few questions over here.
It's Scott Phillips with Chesapeake. So I think you laid out where you need to be, and my question is similar to his, but I'll phrase it another way. What are your 2 to 3 biggest challenges you need to overcome to have a more comprehensive program?
I don't think it's just money. It's not just money. No, it's right. I'm not sure. I'm going to give you my own perspective, and then Ted can say something. I think we're trying to do too much all at the same time. And I think it would be smart for us to figure out what is the 1 or 2 things we think we really need to solve first and go do that together. The second thing is deciding that we all can't do all of that by ourselves and doing a better job, an intellectually honest job of saying what we individually and as organizations can do and can't do and see how we fit together. We're kind of tripping over each other around here, and that needs to stop. Ted
Tina?
gets to talk.
Oh,
It's a TED talk.
And I think Josh covered most of the main stuff, but I think we have some really hard decisions that we have to make. And again, I think that's where there's the plug for the social scientists to become involved here, because I know we have the win-win model for everything, but in California, given how many problems we have there have to be some trade-offs.
Tina Swanson with NRDC. I greatly appreciated the sort of framing of your discussion of the connections across the entire span of the watershed, but I did note that in fact you didn't talk about the upper watersheds at all in your discussion. And I think all of us who work in this system would recognize that given that the upper watersheds is where most of this watershed-driven system starts, and that the lower reaches, the Delta and the Bay, in fact, are integrating a whole series of things which are happening upstream. I'm hoping that you'll talk about that. And in particular, in the upper watersheds, one of the main stressor is the fact that we, society, are competing for finite and limited resources and are currently essentially trying to operate beyond our means. So could you perhaps explore that a little bit?
I'm going to start and then turn it over to Ted. First of all, the wonderful data, the 10 fish metric data that you saw up there was Tina's work, and I went by that pretty quickly. So not long ago, I came out of the Sierra Nevada, where I do quite a bit of work too, and listening to a group of people talk about climate change there, which is all about, the atmospheric rivers aiming right at Tahoe, and what is now a 100-year storm event will be like a 30-year storm event, and that all the bridges are undersized. And I asked the question, so if this hits, and it will, I suppose, and all this water runs downhill, and we have no wet meadows or any other way to store it, the reservoirs just fill and spill? Yes, Dr. Collins, they fill and spill. So all that goes down and it goes into the delta. So we have a huge amount of water coming down and hitting the delta with its full force, potentially breaching levees left and right, and then reaching the bay. My first thought was, this is a catastrophically scary thing. My second thought was, it'll be more natural than it's been for 200 years. So someplace in between those two bookends is something to aim for, but I think big change is coming.
Part of the answer was just plain practical. Just going over the BayDelta in the time we had, 45 minutes, was already pushing it. But also, you know, honestly, given the scale of things, we have to break some problems up a bit. But obviously, a lot of everything is connected. We could have had someone give the same talk Josh gave for the upper watershed. It would have been equally effective.
One of my questions, it kind of follows up on this, is like, we've been talking about, well, with the CalFed BayDelta planning program, we did consider the upper watersheds more than we do now. We had the Sacramento River, you know, the San Joaquin River, Delta, and the Bay, and we kind of always talked about all of those systems. The problem is, as you're pointing out, Ted, is that it's hard to do it all. And so we've narrowed our focus more recently into the Delta, and then of course the Bay has almost like a separate focus. So I think it's just important, it would be great if we could kind of think about like maybe the way the Great Lakes have worked on their system and have a way of coming together and going apart and working on our problems in that way. And so that's one thought. And then the other thing I wanted to just ask about is you had mentioned this property tax for basically in the Bay, and I think great. But then the Delta, we have very few people living in the Delta. So if you have any ideas about how to make that work for us in the Delta, because we just don't have the resources to do what we need to do in the Delta. So that's a question.
All the stories, the narrative about Measure AA that produces the Restoration Authority that uses property tax dollars to pay for tidal marsh restoration of the Bay, those narratives haven't even been written yet. But you just have to remember that, as I said before, that was based upon a very long legacy of environmental activism. And even though the average resident time of a Bay Area person is only 2.5 years now, they moved into that legacy and they knew it. They literally bought into it. So they were willing, they had the political will to push that initiative forward because of the long history of activism. So creating that political will is not something I know about, but I'm certainly appreciative. And I've heard people talk about the importance of that in moving that measure forward in a short, I think it was 4 years from conception to actually passing the measure.
I know I'm going to get myself into trouble for this, but yeah, I agree that there's only, what, 400,000 people or so that live in the Delta, but infrastructure-wise, it's kind of the hub of a lot of the state. I mean, there's the water supply part, but the energy, grid goes right through it. We've got these various gas pipelines, power pipelines. It's a recreation hub. Surely there must be some way to leverage that to support the kind of infrastructure and that includes science to keep it going.
Anitra, I did remember one part of the answer, which I'm repeating from somebody else because it's not my expertise at all. But we stopped talking about endangered species. We didn't put this on the shoulders of the California clapper eel, the salt marsh harvest mouse, which at one time was called the mouse that roared because it stopped development. We talked about green infrastructure. We talked about the importance of tidal marshlands in the transition zone to secure people's lives, really. We put it back on people. And I don't think that was entirely dishonest by us. It's just a different perspective. So it was done in terms of recreation, flood control, pollution control, the kinds of services other than wildlife protection, because they'd heard enough about that.
Are there any more questions? We probably have time for one last. This one, I see one. Okay.
Hi, Lisa Wanger, University of Maryland and Chesapeake Bay, STAC Chair. So I guess what I want to follow up on the question from the woman from NRCS. no, sorry, not NRCS, NRDC. Too many acronyms flying around. So the thing about having the upper watersheds, you know, as an economist, my first thought is, where are the actions taking place that that have the biggest effect on the outcomes that you care most about? So to me, that's the question of, are the upper watersheds relevant to your BayDelta? And that's what I would ask you to address. You know, where are those drivers?
So right now, so much of the management here is for the water supply system. And the operational modeling is pretty well integrated for both the energy generation standpoint and just the volumes, the timing, and so forth. What isn't very well integrated is the ecological part of all that, and I think that in the upper watershed is probably one of the greatest areas that we could leverage. And it's sort of done on an individual basis, but really not in any kind of big picture way that I'm aware of.
I think I would add to that flood control. If we had had the time, we would have talked about flood-safe Central Valley and the effort to imagine those large flows coming out of the montane areas and how to manage them, at least into the delta. And the amount of setback required, you can't build the levees high enough. You have to set them back to accommodate the flow, and there are people owning those lands. So that's going to be a major issue around flood control, is acquiring the property to accommodate the floods. So I think flood control is probably one of those doorways that moves into, starts knocking on the door of political will and how people will get involved. It affects them directly.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back at 3:15 with a presentation from the Puget Sound Science Enterprise Workshop and then a panel discussion. Thanks.